to another episode of Intentional Design. I'm really excited to be joined by Deborah Adair from Quality Matters today. But I'll start in full disclosure. iDesign and Quality Matters have a very special relationship. We've been the premier sponsor of the Chloe Report since I think its inception, which would have been, we're on the Chloe 6, so maybe 6 iterations of that. Is that right, Deb?
Yes, Chloe 6.
And we have an exclusive relationship relative to putting courses that we've designed and redesigned through the Quality Matters certification process, which has been an incredible value to our university partners. So thanks for helping spearhead all that with us, Deb. We really appreciate it. And I know our partners do too. So I wanted to start with just a little history of Quality Matters for anybody who isn't super familiar, just the backstory that helps people understand the research, the peer review process, kind of all those hallmarks of what makes Quality Matters so special in online learning.
Thank you for inviting me to do this, Whitney. So in full disclosure, I had to look up what a vodcast was before I did this. But so a little bit about Quality Matters. So Quality Matters actually had its beginnings in 2003 when Maryland Online got a FIPSE grant. That's the Fund for the Improvement of Secondary Education. So it was a federal grant, and they were trying to solve a specific problem for their, they had a seat bank program where their Maryland Online's member institutions, which were primarily community colleges and a few two-year universities in Maryland. They were trying to share courses, and they needed online courses, I should say. And they needed a way to prove to each other that those courses were of quality and equivalent quality. And that was sort of the birth of the idea of Quality Matters as a way to provide interinstitutional quality assurance for online education. So 3 years later, they had developed a set of quality standards, a rubric, with detailed annotations and examples of best practice. They had a peer review process that could lead to certification and a training program that would work with faculty to help them become the peer reviewers who would do the reviews. So at the end of 2006, the grant money was all spent, and they decided to see if it would go, and it did in fact go. We ran for a while independently, but under Maryland Online's 501c3 umbrella. 2014, we spun off as a fully independent 501c3. And so today we have about 1,500, or a little bit more than 1,500 institutions, educational institutions, primarily higher education and K-12. And in about 32 countries that participate with us.
In the pandemic shift to emergency remote teaching, I wonder how that conversation has changed, and if there's been a change to the schools that you serve or the individuals that you guys are really doing a lot of work with now.
It's an interesting question because that population of schools, the people that we are that we consider our community are really the folks that are implementing the quality practices related to online education within the institutions. And so these are faculty, these are instructional designers, these are directors of online learning, and these are the people who have expertise or have developed expertise in online learning. So and these are the people we've always worked with. So when the pandemic hit, their institutions turned to those people for their expertise. And so we have better insight about that than we do for the institutions that weren't investing. Because one of the things we learned from Chloe was the institutions that had been working and investing in terms of quality with their online program on faculty training and instructional design were in a much better position with the pivot. Having said that, it's still a whole nother task to move from having online education in certain departments or certain parts of the university or college, and then moving everybody online. So even the experts in online education, in that pivot that had to happen in a couple of weeks last spring, they weren't pivoting everybody to fully developed quality online courses. People were just, it was about academic community continuity and getting things online as quickly as possible. So these folks, I think that created some cognitive dissonance for our community who wanted to be doing things in one way, but they didn't have the time or the capacity at their institutions to do it that way. So remote learning, if no one knows this, there's still someone out there that needs to hear this. Remote learning, the emergency remote learning, and online education are very different animals.
You mentioned a really important point, and that was the folks that Quality Matters has been working with for years and years are those individuals on campus who were tasked with the pivot. And Patrice Prusco from Harvard and I had done a bunch of research and talked to a lot of instructional designers just after the pandemic about burnout and instructional designers and getting almost to the point of compassion fatigue or beyond that in some cases. And the stories of people working almost 24 hours a day, trying to take care of their families, being sick with COVID themselves, and the lack of the support from the community, but also the lack of support from the community because everybody was so busy that there wasn't the ability for anybody to kind of lend a hand to someone else within our instructional design community. Did you hear a lot of those same stories, and is it getting better for our instructional design friends?
Absolutely. And I think we were aware of that the whole way through. And because if because we're connected and we kind of feel they're us and we're them in some ways, and so through personal connections and anecdotes, but also because of overall engagement with us for the first few months of the pandemic, everything had to kind of grind to a halt because they were just inundated with the needs of their institution because they were the people who had to make it happen. And so we knew it was happening when it was happening. And, we tried to do what we could. And I know iDesign has done things just to really try to provide some support. But there's no getting away from the kind of workload that those folks had during the pandemic. And I would say instructional designers and faculty who were, especially the faculty champions who already knew and were expert. And so, yeah, those were the stories we heard. And in fact, I just had a meeting, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, we have a QM Instructional Designers Association that's affiliated with us. I think there's like 1,200 folks, I think, at this point. And there was a little conversation there even, and some had even subsequently changed jobs because of burnout. So on the one hand, I do think it's getting better because now there's more, not just awareness, but there's starting to be a little bit more structure. Still not budgets available to hire instructional designers to work at the scale institutions are planning for as they move forward with the changes they're going to make in their educational delivery. And I think one of the things that we want to do at QM, as this is why I was having that conversation with our Instructional Designers Association, is to try to help be much more of an advocate for the role of instructional design. Because, in sort of the lay understanding, the lay understanding of online education is not good, even so. But I just had a conversation with a reporter the other day, and she was the education reporter for this publication, and she knew so little about online education, and she had never heard of an instructional designer. And so, in the stories people tell about, what do you think? What do you need to do in online education? We don't want the efficacy of instructional designers to support the instructional design work to be lost in that messaging at all. And as institutions think about scaling up, what do they need to do to scale up? That's a big piece of it that they need to think about. And so we're in early stages about thinking about how do we work with our own instructional design association and others to be much more purposeful about making this more clear, because to your point, you can't just simply keep adding tasks on to people who are already task saturated. And I hope nobody from QM is listening to me say that.
Well, and if we look back at the Intentional Futures report that came out maybe in 2016 or so, when you looked at the role of the instructional designer, they were already wearing 14 hats, so to speak. And you have done an exemplary job of calling out the importance of instructional designers in the course design process. I think that the data from the Chloe report research has certainly highlighted the value of instructional designers. And I love what you're doing to kind of elevate them within the organization and help articulate the value that they bring to the institutions. One of the things I heard about recently from a mutual friend of ours was about the President's Summit on leading quality. And I wonder, since I didn't have an ear to the ground on that, and maybe a lot of people weren't able to attend, what were some of the big takeaways from that meeting? Was it this advocacy for the ID role and strategic visioneering for institutions in the future with regard to online? Or maybe you can fill us in.
Sure. And I am working on a report out that we'll make available to everybody. So that, and the intention was we didn't record the event because we wanted people to be free. We kept it small because we wanted it conversational. So we invited senior academic leaders from the breadth of higher education, because that's our population spans the breadth of higher education in terms of institution types. And so we tried to keep the numbers small, tried to, I think we were at 60 or 70, so that we could have a real conversation. So we had three big topics. One is, and this went from campus to system. So we had sort of the system role in this, in creating an inclusive learning for systems of education, community college, and university. And there was one on engaging in rigorous learning. What are we doing to, move the needle there? And the third one was about scaling quality. And so when we went through that, we had, the format was, we had some panelists that had part of the session time, went into breakout rooms, and we had conversations with discussants around these topics. And instructional design was not a named topic in there, but in a number of the breakout rooms for more than one of the sessions, this topic came up. And part of it was about the imperative of, especially to scale what we're doing, to have instructional designers, the lack of budgets for them, the scarcity of now finding them. As much as there are people out there who don't know about instructional design, there are plenty of people who now do. So it's becoming a scarcer commodity. One of the presidents that attended said every time they would bring an instructional designer on board and get them set up, Amazon or Google or some big corporation comes in and plucks them away and lures them away with a higher salary. So that should tell us something about how we're valuing or not valuing enough the role of instructional design, because it's not just higher education that's moving online and looking at how to do things online differently. So the market for instructional designers is now very, very hot. And if we don't, as a field, if we don't appreciate and plan for it and take care of it, we're not going to have what we need to be able to move forward with quality.
I love what you said there, because the pandemic didn't just impact institutions of higher education. It did impact everyone, right? And remote work became what we thought was the future of work, right? Became everyone's, or almost everyone's, every day pretty quickly. And so now we have businesses that have figured out that they can actually serve their own staff with onboarding and training needs at scale much easier by having some of the components be asynchronous or synchronous, rather than going around and training at different geographies, right? So I wonder, is QM poised to jump into that space? How do you support corporate learning?
For the last 8 years or so, we have had a continuing and professional education version of our program, both a modified and adapted rubric, but ability to take in those kinds of organizations and associations. And we do. I mean, we have. I can't give you the number. I'm sorry, but we do have a growing number of those. I think for the very reason that you mentioned, and sometimes it's because the migration of an instructional designer from higher education did in fact go to a corporation and wanted the same resources we provided them, and so they brought us into the corporation. And in other cases, these are alternative providers of content and education that want to be able to either partner with or sell to higher education, and they want to make sure that those courses get certified. So what we are finding, though, Whitney, is this is a very broad field. This whole field of everything from the kind of corporate training or the self-paced lynda.com or lynda.com training, and all the way through certifications that are available from alternative providers. And also the length of courses change. And so what I think where we are now is serving those that we already have, but trying to look at what would be really different as we move to these shorter and shorter learning experiences. And that may be more of a function of how the review happens in a more streamlined way than necessarily a huge departure from the set of standards that we use, because really that's just about good teaching, good education, good structure. And so there may be some adaptation required of that, but it's really more of how do you do the work to do the evaluation component of that, because these are the entities that don't have a cadre of faculty that need to be trained. They're producing these opportunities for different reasons with their professional staff, with their professional design staff. And so they don't need to be taught instructional design, but they need some kind of a benchmark or quality vetting that we can provide. So the answer is yes, and we need to be able to do a better job with various types of courses.
Yeah, it's yes and for us too. We got started in higher education, but as you just like you described, QM kind of moved into that corporate space. We're getting more and more asks for alternative credentials, different pathways, stackable pieces of degrees within the degree itself, and third-party providers, to your point earlier, that want to offer up a credential that the employer will accept, but kind of add it as the meat in the sandwich. That's not the right term, but as a piece of the pie on the student pathway to getting that bachelor's degree. And so it's been a fascinating shift in the online education space to see all of these different players come together in order to provide students with alternative options to what was a marketplace of mostly just associates, bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. The landscape seems to have changed quite a lot since you and I first met some 13 years ago.
Yeah, and that was a big topic of conversation actually at the President's Summit, in terms of how higher education is looking at this and how higher education can begin to recognize or validate learning outside the classroom, whether it's PLA, whether it's co-curricular, and what that means for how these colleges and universities do business. How do they structure themselves? It's a cultural change as much as anything else. So I mean, there's a lot of activity that we see now. Even so, QM has sort of learning pathways, credentialed pathways for certain kinds of roles in the QM process, like the master reviewer, and we have a whole a competency approached teaching online certificate program. And both of those have been identified. We're getting interest from academic institutions to give credit for those credentials, college credit for those credentials, because our training is very highly assessed, and we've heard all the time that it's not your typical professional development. The QM's courses are rigorous in the way that like a graduate course would be. So now we're starting to see that as some institutions are looking to increase what they're doing in terms of PLA and embedding industry recognized certifications in appropriate degree programs. So I think that's really a high growth area right now. So it's exciting but super messy, and I think one of the things that we worry about in terms of as you begin to sort of disaggregate, learning into shorter units of learning, and especially as you think about disaggregating a degree, the question really is when you reaggregate who's doing that and what are the quality considerations? Because Mark Miller was at our President's Summit, and he likes to turn a phrase, I think. And so he said, they look at Western governors. They were doing a lot of design thinking about their student programs, and they were conceiving of a program as a family of experiences, not just a accumulation of a set of courses. So what are those other things, other as we reaggregate these pieces into something more meaningful along a degree pathway? What are the connecting points, the things that make that a family of learning experiences? And so this is really a fascinating question in terms as we move forward to this, because I think the work that we're starting to do is so important to students and their ability to progress, but there's still a lot of thinking that has to be done about what does quality mean when you're doing that work. And I don't have the answer. I'm just stating the question that this is where we really need to do some serious thinking.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of individuals now, or individuals at institutions now, that are really taking a microscope to the program level student experience, which I think is a fantastic move forward in the work that we've been doing for ages. Because when you get a faculty thinking about their individual course without being able to lift up and look across the program, what you get is disparate courses. What you get is a puzzle, a pandemic puzzle that won't go together because you'd all get a few of the pieces, right? So how do we get better at looking at the program level considerations and alignment to essential standards or accreditation standards or institutional standards? And I think Quality Matters does an excellent job of setting the bar for that. That's a great conversation for us to continue another time. But you said something about rigor in the QM professional development opportunities. And I know it's been a really long time since I got peer reviewer certified. But when I look back on my QM experience, what I remember as the rigor of that experience was, yes, what was asked of me, but the feedback. The feedback component in a QM professional learning experience is the rigor, in my view. It's that back and forth conversation that unfolds as I'm asked to evaluate something. And the instructors within those QM courses were always so thoughtful and so diligent and so giving of their time to write such lengthy feedback to help those individuals get through those courses. So you've done a just tremendous job of pulling together the right people. And I know since I even went through it, you've moved to Canvas. And there's been a lot of changes. Have you added professional development offerings? Is there anything that somebody who's watching this should know about things that they can follow up on to continue to advance themselves professionally through QM?
So yes, and in fact, we did add quite a bit during the pandemic. A lot of that was just more opportunity rather than a lot of different kinds of courses. But we did. So we have what people I think don't realize about Quality Matters is we don't just have courses about course design and becoming a reviewer. We have the pathways for online teaching, that's just focused on the online teaching piece of it. And then we have different ways to engage. So we have, I guess you could call them courses. We call them web conferencing. So they're 2-hour synchronous learning opportunities on particular topics, a lot of them particular teaching topics. But they are facilitated. They aren't sit and get. They are interactive and they're facilitated, but they're short. And that allows a lot of topic-specific focus that can happen, and allows faculty to come in and out and not have to dedicate as much time as they would to one of the certification courses. And some people just prefer the synchronous opportunity. So we have done much more with those than we had in the past, because those are cohort based, and so they're not open enrollment like a lot of our other courses. Except for right now, we do things like summer camp, and we make those open enrollment. So an individual could just sign up, but typically we're working with the institutions or to put a cohort through and those opportunities. So we did a lot more of that during the pandemic. I think the federal stimulus money that was flowing through sort of had a clock ticking on it, and so I think, as well as the institutions had a clock ticking in terms of being able to help prepare their faculty. So I think that there was a huge demand, and I'm sure we're not the only ones who saw it, in terms of providing professional development. So we had to scale up as quickly as we could to provide those. And just so you know, we are all also working to develop a much more modular approach that's stackable, so that people can move in and out more easily. But there are still going to be those courses, those certification courses with the experience that you just talked about, Whitney, that the nature of the feedback, they can't all be self-paced. There are some of those, we have to ensure that those who get certified actually can do what it is that we need them to do, not just that they just know about it. So that feedback exchange is critical.
Yeah, it was so powerful of a learning experience for me that when I am teaching adjunct at the University of North Texas, I actually don't use grades. I use grades as like an indicator of it's time to do this again, but it's more about the feedback and iteration on what the students are creating. And I think that I can definitely see where I took that from, and that was from the learning that I had at Quality Matters. So thank you. You've made me a better teacher, and my students appreciated it too. Thank you so much, Deb. I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in real life. You were one of the very last people I saw pre-pandemic in real life. It'll be good to see you again when all this ends.
Yes. Yeah, I think all of us. We can't wait.